Ronald Reuel Tolkien, born the 3rd of January 1892, died the 2nd of September 1973, was an English writer and philologist. He was the author of the high fantasy works The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. From 1925 to 1945, Tolkien was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon and a Fellow of both at the University of Oxford. He then moved within the same university to become the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow of Merton College, and held these positions from 1945 until his retirement in 1959. Tolkien was a close friend of C.S. Lewis, a co-member of the informal literary discussion group Tinklings. He was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire Queen Elizabeth II on the 28th of March 1972. After Tolkien's death, his son Christopher published a series of works based on his father's extensive notes and unpublished manuscripts, including the Silmarillion. These, together with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, form a connected body of tales, poems, fictional histories, invented languages, and literary essays about a fantasy world called Arda and, within it, Middle-earth. Between 1951 and 1955, Tolkien applied the term legendarium to the larger part of these writings, while many other authors had published works of fantasy before Tolkien. The great success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings led directly to a popular resurgence of the genre. This has caused him to be popularly identified as the father of modern fantasy literature, or, more precisely, of high fantasy. Biography Ancestric Famalickin was English, and thought of himself as such. His immediate paternal ancestors were middle-class craftsmen who made and sold clocks, watches and pianos in London and Birmingham. The Tolkien family originated in the East Prussian town of Kreuzberg near Königsberg, which had been founded during the medieval German eastward expansion, where his earliest known paternal ancestor Michel Tolkien was born around 1620. Michel's son Christianus Tolkien (1663–1746) was a wealthy miller in Kreuzberg. His son, Christian Tolkien (1706–1791), moved from Kreuzberg to nearby Danzig, and his two sons Daniel Gottlieb Tolkien (1747–1813) and Johann, later known as John Benjamin Tolkien (1750–1819), emigrated to London in the 1770s and became their ancestors. Of the English family, the younger brother was J.R.R. Tolkien's second great-grandfather. In 1792, John Benjamin Tolkien and William Gravel took over the Eardley Norton manufacture in London, which from then on sold clocks and watches under the name Gravel and Tolkien. Daniel Gottlieb obtained British citizenship in 1794, but John Benjamin apparently never became a British citizen. Other German relatives also joined the two brothers in London. Several people with the surname Tolkien or similar spelling, some of them members of the same family as J.R.R. Tolkien, live in northern Germany, but most of them are descendants of people who evacuated East Prussia in 1945. At the end of World War II, according to Richard Derjivsky, the surname Tolkien is of Low Prussian origin and probably means son, descendant of Tolk. Tolkien mistakenly believed his surname derived from the German word Tolkien, meaning foolhardy, and jokingly inserted himself as a cameo into the Notion Club papers under the literally translated name Rash Bold. However, Derjivsky has demonstrated this to be a false etymology, while J.R.R. Tolkien was aware of his family's German origin. His knowledge of the family's history was limited because he was early isolated from the family of his prematurely deceased father. Childhood 1890 to Christmas card with a colored photo of the Tolkien family in Bloemfontein, sent to relatives in Birmingham, England. Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on the 3rd of January 1892 in Bloemfontein, in the Orange Free State, later annexed by the British Empire, now Free State Province, in the Republic of South Africa. To Arthur Reuel Tolkien (1857–1896), an English bank manager, and his wife Mabel, née Suffield (1870–1904). The couple had left England when Arthur was promoted to head the Bloemfontein office of the British bank for which he worked. Tolkien had one sibling, his younger brother, Hilary Arthur Reuel Tolkien, who was born on the 17th of February 1894. As a child, Tolkien was bitten by a large baboon spider in the garden, an event some believe to have been later echoed in his stories. Although he admitted no actual memory of the event and no special hatred of spiders as an adult. In an earlier incident from Tolkien's infancy, a young family servant took the baby to his homestead, returning him the next morning. When he was 3, he went to England with his mother and brother on what was intended to be a lengthy family visit. His father, however, died in South Africa of rheumatic fever before he could join them. This left the family without an income. So Tolkien's mother took him to live with her parents in King's Heath, Birmingham. Soon after, in 1896, they moved to Sarehole, now in Hall Green, then a Worcestershire village. Later annexed to Birmingham, he enjoyed exploring Sarehole Mill and Moseley Bog and the Clint, Lickey and Malvern Hills, which would later inspire scenes in his books, along with nearby towns and villages such as Bromsgrove, Alchester, and Alvehurch, and places such as his Aunt Jane's farm Bag End, the name of which he used in his fiction, Birmingham Oratory, where Tolkien was a parishioner and altar boy. 1902 to 1911. Mabel Tolkien taught her to children. At home, Ronald, as he was known in the family, was a keen pupil. She taught him a great deal of botany and awakened in him the enjoyment of the look and feel of plants. Young Tolkien liked to draw landscapes and trees, but his favorite lessons were those concerning languages, and his mother taught him the rudiments of Latin very early. Tolkien could read by the age of 4 and could write fluently soon afterwards. His mother allowed him to read many books. He disliked Treasure Island and the Pied Piper and thought Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was amusing but disturbing. He liked stories about Red Indians, the term then used for Native Americans, and adventure stories and works of fantasy by George MacDonald. In addition, the fairy books of Andrew Lang were particularly important to him, and their influence is apparent in some of his later writings. King Edward's School in Birmingham, where Tolkien was a pupil 1900 to 1902. 1903 to 1911, Mabel Tolkien was received into the Roman Catholic Church. In 1900, despite vehement protests by her Baptist family, which stopped all financial assistance to her. In 1904, when J.R.R. Tolkien was 12, his mother died of acute diabetes at Fern Cottage in Rednall, which she was renting. She was then about 34 years of age, about as old as a person with diabetes mellitus type. One could survive without treatment. Insulin would not be discovered until 1921. 2 decades later, 9 years after her death, Tolkien wrote, "My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts as he did to Hilary and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." Before her death, Mabel Tolkien had assigned the guardianship of her sons to her close friend, Father Francis Xavier Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory, who was assigned to bring them up as good Catholics. In a 1965 letter to his son Michael, Tolkien recalled the influence of the man whom he always called Father Francis. He was an upper-class Welsh Spaniard Tory, and seemed to some just a pottering old gossip. He was and he was not. I first learned charity and forgiveness from him, and in the light of it pierced even the liberal darkness out of which I came, knowing more about Bloody Mary than the mother of Jesus, who was never mentioned except as an object of wicked worship by the Romanists. After his mother's death, Tolkien grew up in the Edgbaston area of Birmingham and attended King Edward's School, Birmingham, and later St. Philip's School. In 1903, he won a foundation scholarship and returned to King Edward's. Yet while in his early teens, Tolkien had his first encounter with a constructed language, Animalic, an invention of his cousins, Mary and Marjorie Incledon. At that time, he was studying Latin and Anglo-Saxon. Their interest in Animalic soon died away, but Mary and others, including Tolkien himself, invented a new and more complex language called Nevbosh. The next constructed language he came to work with, Nafarin, would be his own creation. Tolkien learned Esperanto sometime before 1909. Around the 10th of June 1909 he composed the Book of the Foxrook, a 16-page notebook, where the earliest example of one of his invented alphabets appears. Short texts in this notebook are written in Esperanto. In 1911, while they were at King Edward's School, Tolkien and three friends, Rob Gilson, Geoffrey Batch Smith, and Christopher Wiseman, formed a semi-secret society they called the TCBS. The initials stood for Tea Club and Barrovian Society, alluding to their fondness for drinking tea in Barrow stores near the school and, secretly, in the school library. After leaving school, the members stayed in touch and, in December 1914, they held a council in London at Wiseman's home. For Tolkien, the result of this meeting was a strong dedication to writing poetry. In 1911, Tolkien went on a summer holiday in Switzerland, a trip that he recollected vividly in a 1968 letter, noting that Bilbo's journey across the misty mountains, including the glissade down the slithering stones into the pine woods, is directly based on his adventures as their party of 12 hiked from Interlaken to Lauterbrunnen and on to camp in the moraines beyond Mürren. 57 years later, Tolkien remembered his regret at leaving the view of the eternal snows of Jungfrau and Silberhorn, the Silvertini Celebdil of my dreams. They went across the Klein Scheidegg to Grindelwald and on across the Gross Scheidegg to Meiringen. They continued across the Grimsel Pass, through the upper Valais to Brigg and onto the Lech Glacier and Zermatt. In October of the same year, Tolkien began studying at Exeter College, Oxford. He initially read classics but changed his course in 1913 to English language and literature, graduating in 1915 with first-class honors. Among his tutors at Oxford was Joseph Wright, whose primer of the Gothic language had inspired Tolkien as a schoolboy. Courtship and marriage. At the age of 16, Tolkien met Edith Mary Bratt, who was 3 years his senior, when he and his brother Hilary moved into the boarding house where she lived in Duchess Road, Edgbaston. According to Humphrey Carpenter, Edith and Ronald took to frequenting Birmingham tea shops, especially one which had a balcony overlooking the pavement. There they would sit and throw sugar lumps into the hats of passers-by, moving to the next table when the sugar bowl was empty. With two people of their personalities and in their position, romance was bound to flourish. Both were orphans in need of affection, and they found that they could give it to each other. During the summer of 1909, they decided that they were in love. His guardian, Father Morgan, considered it altogether unfortunate that his surrogate son was romantically involved with an older Protestant woman. Tolkien wrote that the combined tensions contributed to his having muffed his exams. Morgan prohibited him from meeting, talking to, or even corresponding with Edith until he was 21. Tolkien obeyed this prohibition to the letter, with one notable early exception, over which Father Morgan threatened to cut short his university career if he did not stop. On the evening of his 21st birthday, Tolkien wrote to Edith, who was living with family friend C.H. Jessup at Cheltenham. He declared that he had never ceased to love her, and asked her to marry him. Edith replied that she had already accepted the proposal of George Field, the brother of one of her closest school friends. But Edith said she had agreed to marry Field only because she felt on the shelf and had begun to doubt that Tolkien still cared for her. She explained that, because of Tolkien's letter, everything had changed. On the 8th of January 1913, Tolkien traveled by train to Cheltenham and was met on the platform by Edith. The two took a walk into the countryside, sat under a railway viaduct, and talked. By the end of the day, Edith had agreed to accept Tolkien's proposal. She wrote to Field and returned her engagement ring. Field was dreadfully upset at first, and the Field family was insulted and angry. Upon learning of Edith's new plans, Jessup wrote to her guardian, "I have nothing to say against Tolkien. He is a cultured gentleman, but his prospects are poor in the extreme, and when he will be in a position to marry I cannot imagine. Had he adopted a profession it would have been different." Following their engagement, Edith reluctantly announced that she was converting to Catholicism at Tolkien's insistence. Jessup, like many others of his age and class, strongly anti-Catholic, was infuriated, and he ordered Edith to find other lodgings. Edith Brett and Ronald Tolkien were formally engaged at Birmingham in January 1913, and married at St. Mary Immaculate Catholic Church at Warwick on the 22nd of March 1916. In his 1941 letter to Michael, Tolkien expressed admiration for his wife's willingness to marry a man with no job, little money, and no prospects except the likelihood of being killed in the Great War. First World War, Tolkien in his military uniform, in August 1914. Britain entered the First World War. Tolkien's relatives were shocked when he elected not to volunteer immediately for the British Army. In a 1941 letter to his son Michael, Tolkien recalled in those days chaps joined up, or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage. Instead, Tolkien endured obloquy, and entered a program by which he delayed enlistment until completing his degree. By the time he passed his finals in July 1915, Tolkien recalled that the hints were becoming outspoken from relatives. He was commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers on the 15th of July 1915. He trained with the 13th Reserve Battalion on Cannock Chase, Rugeley Camp near to Rugeley, Staffordshire, for 11 months. In a letter to Edith, Tolkien complained gentlemen are rare among the superiors, and even human beings rare indeed. Following their wedding, Lieutenant and Mrs. Tolkien took up lodgings near the training camp. On the 2nd of June 1916, Tolkien received a telegram summoning him to Folkestone for posting to France. The Tolkiens spent the night before his departure in a room at the Plough and Harrow Hotel in Edgbaston, Birmingham. He later wrote, "Junior officers were being killed off, a dozen a minute, parting from my wife then. It was like a death." France, on the 5th of June 1916, Tolkien boarded a troop transport for an overnight voyage to Calais. Like other soldiers arriving for the first time, he was sent to the British Expeditionary Forces Base Depot at Etaples. On the 7th of June, he was informed that he had been assigned as a signals officer to the 11th Service Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. The battalion was part of the 74th Brigade, 25th Division. While waiting to be summoned to his unit, Tolkien sank into boredom. To pass the time, he composed a poem titled The Lonely Isle, which was inspired by his feelings during the sea crossing to Calais. To evade the British Army's postal censorship, he developed a code of dots by which Edith could track his movements. He left Etaples on the 27th of June 1916 and joined his battalion at Rubemper, near Amiens. He found himself commanding enlisted men who were drawn mainly from the mining, milling, and weaving towns of Lancashire. According to John Garth, he felt an affinity for these working-class men, but military protocol prohibited friendships with other ranks. Instead, he was required to take charge of them, discipline them, train them, and probably censor their letters. If possible, he was supposed to inspire their love and loyalty. Tolkien later lamented, "The most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." Battle of the Somme, the Schwaben Redoubt, painting by William Orpen. Imperial War Museum, London. Tolkien arrived at the Somme in early July 1916. In between turns behind the lines at Bouzencourt, he participated in the assaults on the Schwaben Redoubt and the Leipzig salient. Tolkien's time in combat was a terrible stress for Edith, who feared that every knock on the door might carry news of her husband's death. Edith could track her husband's movements on a map of the Western Front. The Reverend Mervyn S. Evers, Anglican chaplain to the Lancashire Fusiliers, recorded that Tolkien and his fellow officers were eaten by hordes of lice which found the medical officer's ointment merely a kind of hors d'oeuvre, and the little beggars went at their feast with renewed vigor. On the 27th of October 1916, as his battalion attacked Regina Trench, Tolkien contracted trench fever, a disease carried by lice. He was invalided to England on the 8th of November 1916, according to his children John and Priscilla Tolkien in later years. He would occasionally talk of being at the front of the horrors of the first German gas attack, of the utter exhaustion and ominous quiet after a bombardment, of the whining scream of the shells, and the endless marching, always on foot, through a devastated landscape, sometimes carrying the men's equipment as well as his own to encourage them to keep going. Some remarkable relics survive from that time. A trench map he drew himself, pencil-written orders to carry bombs to the fighting line. Many of his dearest school friends were killed in the war. Among their number were Rob Gilson of the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, who was killed on the first day of the Somme while leading his men in the assault. On Beaumont Hamel, fellow DCBS member Jeffrey Smith was killed during the battle, when a German artillery shell landed on a first aid post. Tolkien's battalion was almost completely wiped out following his return to England. Men of the 1st Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers in a communication trench near Beaumont Hamel, 1916. Photo by Ernest Brooks according to John Garth, Kitchener's army, in which Tolkien served, at once marked existing social boundaries and counteracted the class system by throwing everyone into a desperate situation together. Tolkien was grateful, writing that it had taught him a deep sympathy and feeling for the Tommy, especially the plain soldier from the agricultural counties. Home front. A weak and emaciated Tolkien spent the remainder of the war alternating between hospitals and garrison duties, being deemed medically unfit for general service. During his recovery in a cottage in Little Heywood, Staffordshire, he began to work on what he called the Book of Lost Tales, beginning with the Fall of Gondolin. Lost Tales represented Tolkien's attempt to create a mythology for England, a project he would abandon without ever completing. Throughout 1917 and 1918 his illness kept recurring, but he had recovered enough to do home service at various camps. It was at this time that Edith bore their first child, John Francis Reuel Tolkien. In a 1941 letter, Tolkien described his son John as conceived and carried during the starvation year of 1917 and the great U-boat campaign round about the Battle of Cambrai, when the end of the war seemed as far off as it does now. Tolkien was promoted to the temporary rank of lieutenant on the 6th of January 1918. When he was stationed at Kingston upon Hull, he and Edith went walking in the woods at nearby Roos, and Edith began to dance for him in a clearing among the flowering hemlock. After his wife's death in 1971, Tolkien remembered, "I never called Edith Luthien, but she was the source of the story that in time became the chief part of the Silmarillion. It was first conceived in a small woodland glade filled with hemlocks at Roos in Yorkshire, where I was for a brief time in command of an outpost of the Humber garrison in 1917, and she was able to live with me for a while. In those days her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance. But the story has gone crooked, and I am left, and I cannot plead before the inexorable Mandos." On the 16th of July 1919, Tolkien was taken off active service at Fovant on Salisbury Plain, with a temporary disability pension. Academic and writing career to Darnley Road, the former home of Tolkien in West Park, Leeds. 20 Northmoor Road, one of Tolkien's former homes in Oxford, on the 3rd of November 1920. Tolkien was demobilized and left the army, retaining his rank of lieutenant. His first civilian job after World War I was at the Oxford English Dictionary, where he worked mainly on the history and etymology of words of Germanic origin beginning with the letter W. In 1920, he took up a post as reader in English language at the University of Leeds, becoming the youngest member of the academic staff there. While at Leeds, he produced a Middle English vocabulary and a definitive edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight with E.V. Gordon. Both became academic standard works for several decades. He translated Sir Gawain, Pearl, and Sir Orfeo. In 1925, he returned to Oxford as Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon, with a fellowship at Pembroke College. In mid-1919, he began to tutor undergraduates privately, most importantly those of Lady Margaret Hall and St. Hugh's College, given that the women's colleges were in great need of good teachers in their early years. And Tolkien as a married professor, then still not common, was considered suitable. As a bachelor, Don would not have been. During his time at Pembroke College, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings, while living at 20 Northmoor Road in North Oxford. He also published a philological essay in 1932 on the name Nodens, following Sir Mortimer Wheeler's unearthing of a Roman Asclepiad at Lydney Park, Gloucestershire. In 1928, Beowulf, a translation and commentary, and on translating Beowulf in the 1920s. Tolkien undertook a translation of Beowulf, which he finished in 1926, but did not publish. It was later edited by his son Christopher and published in 2014. Second World War, Merton College, where Tolkien was professor of English language and literature 1945 to 1959. In the run-up to the Second World War, Tolkien was earmarked as a codebreaker. In January 1939, he was asked to serve in the cryptographic department of the Foreign Office in the event of national emergency. Beginning on the 27th of March, he took an instructional course at the London HQ of the Government Code and Cipher School. He was informed in October that his services would not be required. In 1945, Tolkien moved to Merton College, Oxford, becoming the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature, in which post he remained until his retirement in 1959. He served as an external examiner for University College, Galway now and UI Galway, for many years. In 1954, Tolkien received an honorary degree from the National University of Ireland, of which University College, Galway, was a constituent college. Tolkien completed The Lord of the Rings in 1948, close to a decade after the first sketches. Family the Tolkiens had for children. John Francis Reuel Tolkien, the 17th of November 1917-20 to January 2003. Michael Hilary Reuel Tolkien, the 22nd of October 1920 to 27 February 1984. Christopher John Reuel Tolkien, the 21st of November 1924 16 January 2020. And Priscilla Marian Reuel Tolkien, 18th of June 1929, 28 February 2022. Tolkien was very devoted to his children and sent them illustrated letters from Father Christmas when they were young. Retirement. Bust of Tolkien in the chapel of Exeter College, Oxford, during his life in retirement. From 1959 up to his death in 1973, Tolkien received steadily increasing public attention and literary fame. In 1961, his friend C.S. Lewis even nominated him for the Nobel Prize in Literature. The sales of his books were so profitable that he regretted that he had not chosen early retirement. In a 1972 letter, he deplored having become a cult figure, but admitted that even the nose of a very modest idol cannot remain entirely untickled by the sweet smell of incense. Fan attention became so intense that Tolkien had to take his phone number out of the public directory, and eventually he and Edith moved to Bournemouth, which was then a seaside resort patronized by the British upper middle class. Tolkien's status as a best-selling author gave them easy entry into polite society, but Tolkien deeply missed the company of his fellow Inklings. Edith, however, was overjoyed to step into the role of a society hostess, which had been the reason that Tolkien selected Bournemouth in the first place. The genuine and deep affection between Ronald and Edith was demonstrated by their care about the other's health, in details like wrapping presents. In the generous way he gave up his life at Oxford so she could retire to Bournemouth, and in her pride in his becoming a famous author. They were tied together, too, by love for their children and grandchildren. In his retirement, Tolkien was a consultant and translator for the Jerusalem Bible, published in 1966. He was initially assigned a larger portion to translate, but, due to other commitments, only managed to offer some criticisms of other contributors and a translation of the Book of Jonah. Final years, The Grave of J.R.R. And Edith Tolkien, Wolvercote Cemetery, Oxford. Edith died on the 29th of November 1971, at the age of 82. Ronald returned to Oxford, where Merton College gave him convenient rooms near the High Street. He missed Edith, but enjoyed being back in the city. Tolkien was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 1972 New Year honors and received the insignia of the Order at Buckingham Palace on the 28th of March 1972. In the same year, Oxford University gave him an honorary doctorate of letters. He had the name Luthien Sick engraved on Edith's tombstone at Wolvercote Cemetery, Oxford. When Tolkien died 21 months later on the 2nd of September 1973 from a bleeding ulcer and chest infection, at the age of 81, he was buried in the same grave, with Buren added to his name. Tolkien's will was proven on the 20th of December 1973, with his estate valued at £190, 577 equivalent to pounds, for 152 in 2021.